The disappearance of twins shattered a mother's world in 1961, leaving only emptiness where laughter once filled her home. For 64 agonizing years, she carried the weight of not knowing, her heart never truly whole again. Then, in a moment that defies all odds, she walks into a church and comes face to face with the children time stole from her. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The first notes of Sunday's hymn echoed through the old church in rural Pennsylvania, sending chills down Mary Brown's spine. At 88, she sat in the third pew, her weathered hands trembling slightly as they gripped her worn hymnal. The familiar melody transported her back to that foggy March morning in 1961, when laughter turned to silence and her world collapsed around her. Mary closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. For decades she had listened for those voices in every crowd, every choir, every gathering, never daring to hope she might actually hear them again. The twins had been just 4 years old when they vanished, their matching dresses and ribboned hair the last image burned into her memory. The elderly woman had spent countless hours wandering the creaking hallways of her aging farmhouse, the floorboards bearing witness to her grief. Each night she would sit by the window in their untouched bedroom, clutching a faded photo album filled with precious snapshots, first steps, birthday celebrations, Christmas mornings, moments frozen in time. Beside her now in the church pew, her grandson John squeezed her hand gently. The young man had grown up watching his grandmother's quiet rituals of remembrance, inheriting her determination if not her pain. He had become her strength when her body began to fail, though her mind remained sharp as ever. "Are you all right?" he whispered, concern etching his features. Mary nodded, unable to explain how the soprano section of the choir had momentarily transported her. There had been something in the harmonies, something hauntingly familiar, that made her heart race. Back home after service, she would once again take out the tiny lavender dress from the cedar chest, running her fingers over each delicate stitch. The garment was faded now, but Mary had preserved it carefully, along with its matching twist. Each thread represented a memory, a fragile lifeline tying her to the daughters the world had urged her to forget. The community had moved on long ago. Time heals, they'd say, avoiding her gaze at social gatherings. You still have so much to be thankful for. But time had only taught Mary patience, not forgetfulness. Even as neighbors whispered about her obsession, she continued searching, questioning, hoping. In her bedroom stood a calendar where she had marked every passing day since they disappeared. 23,376 days of emptiness. Yet something about today's service felt different. As the final hymn concluded and parishioners filed out, Mary remained seated, her eyes fixed on the choir loft, a strange sensation stirring within her that she hadn't felt in decades. Possibility. Autumn leaves crunched beneath Mary Brown's feet as she made her way down the winding path to the courthouse. At 88, each step required effort, but determination pushed her forward. The search for her twin daughters had become her life's mission again, despite the whispers that followed her through town. Poor Mary, still chasing ghosts, she overheard Mrs. Wilson murmur to another shopper at the general store. The pitying glances stung worse than outright rejection. But Mary had endured 64 years of such looks. What was another season of them? She sent carefully penned letters to relatives in neighboring counties, some she hadn't contacted in decades. Her arthritic hands trembled as she sealed each envelope, praying this time someone would remember something, anything about 2 little girls who vanished in 1961. The courthouse became her second home that fall. Mary pored over birth certificates, adoption records, and old newspapers, squinting through her reading glasses at faded ink that held no answers. The smell of musty paper and floor polish became as familiar as her own farmhouse. "Miss Brown, I've told you 3 times this week," Robert Johnson said, exasperation evident in his voice as he adjusted his tie. The county clerk's patience had worn thin. "We have no records from that year. There was a flood in the basement archive. Everything was destroyed." But Mary noticed how he avoided her eyes, how his fingers tapped nervously on his desk. She'd lived long enough to recognize a lie when she heard one. "I'll be back tomorrow," she replied simply, gathering her handbag. The cemetery offered no more comfort than the courthouse. Mary walked between weathered headstones, searching for names that might connect to her daughter's disappearance. Sometimes she brought flowers, placing them on graves of people who might have known something but took their secrets to the earth. Father Michael Smith found her there one evening as dusk settled over the hills. The young priest approached cautiously, his collar stark white against his black coat. "Mary, this isn't healthy," he said gently, helping her to her feet. "The community needs to heal. Stirring up the past only opens old wounds." "My wounds never closed, Father," Mary answered, her voice steady despite the cold. "And this town has secrets that need stirring." The priest sighed, glancing toward the church spire visible above the trees. "Some secrets protect people. The scandal could tear families apart." "My family was already torn apart," Mary replied, "and I won't stop until I know why." As they walked back toward town, Father Michael's shoulders slumped with the weight of knowledge he wasn't ready to share. Mary noticed but said nothing. The truth would surface eventually. It always did. Like the fallen leaves around them, secrets couldn't stay buried forever. As the days shortened and winter crept in, Mary Brown's health began to falter. Her arthritic hands trembled as she traced Elizabeth and Margaret, the birth names of her twins, in the margins of old school books. The 88-year-old woman spent hours in her farmhouse's sitting room, the space warmed inadequately by an aging radiator, surrounded by memories that both comforted and tormented her. "You're chasing ghosts," Robert Johnson had told her last week at the courthouse. "For your own peace, let them rest." The county clerk's dismissive tone echoed the sentiments of many townsfolk who had grown weary of the elderly woman's decades-long search. Even John worried about his grandmother's deteriorating condition, noticing how she ate less and slept poorly. Mary's determination remained steadfast despite her frailty. She organized newspaper clippings chronologically, searching for patterns that might have eluded her all these years. Yet doubt crept in during the long winter nights. Had she imagined the suspicious circumstances? Was her memory playing tricks? The whispers around town suggested as much, that grief had twisted her perception of what happened that foggy March morning in 1961. "I'm not crazy," she whispered to the empty room, clutching the tiny lavender dress that once belonged to Rebecca. "I know what happened to my girls." Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, an unexpected visitor arrived at her door. Sarah Davis, bundled against the December chill, clutched a leather-bound book to her chest. "I found this while clearing out my mother-in-law's attic," Sarah explained, her expression a mixture of guilt and resolve. "Mrs. Goodwin kept detailed diaries. I think you should see this one." Mary's hands shook as she accepted the diary. Between recipes for apple cobbler and notes about harvest festivals, she discovered entries that made her blood run cold. Mrs. Goodwin, a woman Mary had considered a friend, had written about arrangements made for the twins and protecting the family name. "She was part of it," Mary whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "They were taken to protect someone's reputation." Sarah nodded solemnly. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea what my husband's family had done." The revelation stung like an open wound. Neighbors she'd trusted had conspired against her. Yet amid the pain, a spark ignited within Mary. The diary provided the first tangible evidence that her daughters hadn't simply vanished. They had been taken, hidden, perhaps even nearby. "Thank you," Mary told Sarah, clutching the diary to her chest. "This changes everything." For the first time in months, Mary slept soundly that night, her resolve fueled by the bitter truth that had finally begun to emerge. Mary's trembling fingers traced the faded ink in Miss Goodwin's diary, each word more devastating than the last. The pages revealed a calculated deception that spanned decades. Mrs. Goodwin, the neighbor Mary had once trusted with her deepest sorrows, had been the architect of her greatest pain. "The Brown girls must be placed elsewhere," one entry read. "Mary's situation, unmarried and destitute, brings shame to our community. I've convinced her they'll be safer away from here." The diary detailed how Miss Goodwin had fabricated stories about the twins being taken to a better home in another state. She had planted false leads, intercepted letters, and silenced anyone who questioned the narrative, all to protect the town from what she deemed a moral stain. a single mother raising children in poverty. Mary set the diary down on her kitchen table, the same table where she'd fed her babies 64 years ago. The betrayal cut deep. Her neighbor hadn't acted alone. Entries mentioned arrangements with Robert Johnson at the county office and several church elders who agreed the separation was for the best. "Grandmother?" John Brown appeared in the doorway, concern etched across his face. "Are you all right?" Mary wiped her tears with the corner of her cardigan. "They never left the county, John. My girls were here all along." Her grandson sat beside her, placing his hand over hers. The revelation changed everything. If Miss Goodwin had lied about sending the twins away, they might still be nearby, perhaps even in the same town where Mary had spent decades searching. "Look here." Mary pointed to another entry. "She mentions Elizabeth Miller taking them in. The Millers live just 3 miles down the road." A strange mixture of hope and anger surged through Mary's veins. The cruelty of keeping her daughters so close yet unreachable was almost unbearable. She thought of all the times she might have passed her own children in the street, at the market, or during Sunday service, never knowing who they were. Yet amid the heartbreak bloomed a fragile hope. If her daughters had grown up nearby, perhaps finding them wasn't impossible after all. The thought gave Mary strength as winter approached, bringing with it bitter winds that rattled the farmhouse windows. That night, Mary added Mrs. Goodwin's diary to the box containing the lavender dress and photo album. These items, once mere mementos of loss, had transformed into clues, breadcrumbs leading toward a reunion she had never dared to imagine possible. "We'll find them," she whispered to herself as snow began to fall outside. For the first time in years, the winter ahead didn't seem quite so long or lonely. January brought Pennsylvania's harshest chill seeping through the cracks of Mary Brown's aging farmhouse. The 88-year-old's hands trembled not just with hope, but with the arthritis that had worsened over decades of turning album pages and clutching that tiny lavender dress. Her body betrayed her now when her spirit remained strongest. "I can't make it to the courthouse today," Mary admitted reluctantly to her grandson. John Brown nodded, his eyes reflecting the same determination that had sustained his grandmother through 64 winters of searching. The young man had grown up watching her unwavering quest, and now that she physically couldn't continue, he would become her legs, her voice. "I'll go to Thomas Davis instead," John said, tucking a worn photograph into his pocket. "The lawyer might have records the courthouse claims don't exist." Mary squeezed his hand. "Robert Johnson has blocked me at every turn. Perhaps Thomas will be different." The following morning, John navigated the snow-covered roads to the lawyer's office downtown. The modest building housed decades of the community's secrets in manila folders and leather-bound books. Thomas Davis greeted him with cautious eyes but offered his assistance when John explained his grandmother's plight. Most records from that period were selectively preserved, the lawyer admitted, leading John to a back room filled with filing cabinets. "But I keep everything, even what others deemed forgettable." For hours John sifted through yellowed papers, legal notices, and correspondence. His fingers grew numb from the cold and repetition until a single envelope caught his attention. Inside was a letter from 1963, describing new members of the church choir. One passage made his heart stop. "The younger woman sings beautifully despite her nervousness. You'd recognize her by the crescent-shaped scar above her right eyebrow." John's hands shook. His aunt, his mother's twin, had been born with that exact mark. In the family album, every childhood photo of Emily showed that distinctive crescent, a detail Mary had described countless times during bedtime stories about the daughters she'd lost. When he returned to the farmhouse, Mary was huddled near the fireplace, a quilt wrapped around her thin shoulders. As John read the letter aloud, color returned to her pale cheeks. "Emily," she whispered, touching the faded photograph on her lap. "My Emily had that scar from birth." For the first time in months, Mary rose without assistance, moving to the window to watch snowflakes dance in the winter light. "They're here, John. They've been here all along." The bitter Pennsylvania cold still rattled the windows, but inside Mary Brown's heart, something long frozen had begun to thaw. The morning after John Brown discovered the letter, a sharp knock at the farmhouse door startled Mary from her prayer. Peter Johnson stood on the porch, his weathered face twisted with anger. The elderly neighbor had been a fixture in the community for decades, his family's roots as deep as the oak trees that lined the property. "You need to stop this nonsense," Peter hissed, refusing to step inside. His eyes darted nervously toward the old photograph album, visible on Mary's side table. "Some things are better left buried. My father helped arrange everything back then for your own good." Mary's hands trembled as she clutched the doorframe. "My daughters weren't things to be buried," she whispered. Peter leaned closer. "If John keeps digging, I'll make sure everyone knows about your husband's gambling debts, how close you were to losing this house. Is that what you want people remember?" After he left, fear settled over the farmhouse like dust. Mary sat in her rocking chair, the weight of Peter's threats pressing down on her frail shoulders. When John arrived that afternoon, she considered begging him to abandon their search. "He knows something," John said, pacing the worn floorboards. "Why else would he threaten us?" The young man's determination reminded Mary of herself decades ago when she'd first begun searching for her twins. That evening, John drove to the church, finding Father Michael Smith arranging hymnals in the empty sanctuary. The parish priest looked up, his youthful face shadowed with concern. "The Johnsons were deeply involved in the church back then," John explained, his voice echoing in the sacred space. "Peter's father was on some committee with Mrs. Goodwin." Father Michael sighed, setting down the leather-bound book. "I've heard whispers since I arrived. Old scandals, buried secrets. My grandmother has spent 64 years searching," John said. "Faith shouldn't protect lies, Father. It should illuminate truth." The priest was silent for a long moment, running his fingers along the polished pew. "The choir is adding new members for Easter," he finally said. "I can't directly help, but I'll pay attention to any women who might match your descriptions." John nodded gratefully. "That's all I ask." As he drove back to Mary's farmhouse, determination replaced his earlier fear. Peter Johnson might have silenced others with his threats, but John wouldn't be intimidated. His grandmother had waited too long already. When he told Mary about Father Michael's reluctant agreement, her eyes brightened for the first time in days. She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you for not giving up," she whispered. The first blossoms of spring dotted the Pennsylvania countryside, but for Mary Brown the season brought a fresh wave of resistance rather than renewal. After months of searching, she had finally located two women who matched her daughter's descriptions perfectly, Rebecca and Catherine, only to face their complete disbelief when she approached them after Sunday service. "I'm sorry, but you must be mistaken," Rebecca said, the scar above her eyebrow, identical to the one Mary remembered, catching the light as she stepped back. "My name has always been Rebecca Miller. My sister and I were raised by Elizabeth Miller. Our mother, Catherine," standing protectively beside her twin, displayed the same birthmark on her wrist that Mary had once kissed goodnight. "We've lived in this town our entire lives," she added firmly. "We would remember if you were our mother." The elderly woman's hands trembled as she clutched her purse, inside which lay the faded photographs she'd brought as evidence. John Brown stood beside his grandmother, watching helplessly as the twins politely but firmly excused themselves. The truth emerged gradually over the following weeks. Through conversations with Sarah Davis and reluctant admissions from older townsfolk, Mary discovered that Elizabeth Miller had paid substantial sums to ensure silence. The betrayal cut deeper when she learned that half the town had been complicit. Neighbors, shopkeepers, even former friends had accepted money to maintain the deception. "They grew up just 4 blocks from your farmhouse," Sarah confessed one afternoon, shame coloring her words. Elizabeth changed their names slightly but kept them in plain sight. She believed no one would suspect she'd keep them so close. Mary sat stunned in her rocking chair, realizing how many times she must have passed her own daughters on the street, perhaps even exchanged pleasantries with them at the market or post office. The twins had attended the same church, shopped at the same stores, and participated in the same harvest festivals, all while Mary searched desperately in distant counties and states. "I might have handed Rebecca change at the general store," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I could have complimented Catherine's singing without knowing she was mine." The revelation was both heartbreaking and strangely comforting. Her daughters had never truly been lost. They had been within reach all along, separated only by a wall of lies and silence that money had built. The betrayal stung deeply, but it also meant that reuniting with them might not be impossible after all. "They're here, John," Mary said, a fragile hope flickering in her eyes. "After all these years, my girls have been right here all along." John Brown sat at the kitchen table, a single sheet of yellowed paper trembling in his hands. The letter, addressed to his grandmother but never sent, had been tucked inside an old Bible at Thomas Davis's law office. The lawyer had discovered it while searching through archive documents from the 60s. "I've known about your daughters for years," the anonymous writer had confessed. "Many of us have. We were paid to stay quiet, but the burden grows heavier each day. Your girls are closer than you think." John's throat tightened as he slid the letter across the table to Mary. Her weathered hands shook as she read the words, tears welling in her eyes. The farmhouse kitchen, usually filled with the comforting scent of mint tea and fresh bread, now felt heavy with decades of betrayal. "Someone knew," Mary whispered, her voice breaking. "All these years, someone knew and said nothing." Her grandson reached across the table, covering her trembling fingers with his own. "But they wanted to tell you. They just couldn't find the courage." The elderly woman stared out the window at the Pennsylvania countryside, where spring was painting the hills green. 88 years had etched deep lines into her face, but the revelation brought a spark to her eyes that John hadn't seen in months. "All those times I walked through town," Mary said, "wondering if I'd passed my own flesh and blood without knowing. And now it seems I might have." She clutched the faded photo album that never left her side, running her fingers over the twins' infant faces. The knowledge that her daughters might have grown up in this very community, perhaps even attended the same church or shopped at the same stores, was both comforting and devastating. "I don't know whether to be grateful or furious," she admitted, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. 64 years of searching, and they could have been within reach the entire time. John poured more tea, the steam rising between them like the ghosts of wasted years. "This confirms what we suspected. The town's silence wasn't perfect. There were cracks." Mary nodded slowly, determination hardening her features. "And where there are cracks, there's a way through." She carefully folded the letter and placed it inside the album, alongside the tiny lavender dress she'd preserved for decades. The emotional toll of this revelation weighed heavily on her frail shoulders, but she straightened them nonetheless. "Tomorrow," she said firmly, "we speak with Father Michael again. If someone in this town was willing to write this letter, others might be ready to talk now." John nodded, admiring his grandmother's resilience. The search that had consumed their lives would continue, fueled by this new confirmation that the truth had never been completely buried, only waiting to be unearthed. August brought a chill to the air that had nothing to do with the weather. Father Michael Smith paced the length of his small office, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. On his desk lay a stack of yellowed church records, baptisms, marriages, and private notes from priests long past, that could either heal or destroy his community. Mary Brown sat across from him, her weathered hands folded in her lap. John stood behind his grandmother, a protective presence. The young priest had grown fond of them both over these months of searching, but his duty to the parish weighed heavily on his conscience. "These records are sacred," Father Michael said, gesturing to the pile. "Some contain confessions, private matters. Opening them could hurt many families still living here." Mary's eyes, bright despite her 88 years, remained fixed on him. "My family was already hurt," she replied softly. The priest picked up a particular folder, hesitating. "Your name appears in these notes, Mrs. Brown. The previous pastor referred to you as," he paused, "uncomfortable, a troublesome mother who wouldn't accept God's will." John stepped forward. "That's outrageous." "The church was different then," Father Michael explained. "Unwed mothers, financial struggles, these were considered moral failings, not circumstances deserving compassion." Mary straightened her back. "I've been called worse than troublesome in my time." Father Michael spent that night in prayer, torn between institutional loyalty and the clear injustice before him. By morning, exhausted but resolved, he made his decision. When Mary and John returned the next day, they found him waiting with the records spread across his desk. "I took an oath to serve God by serving his people," the priest said, his voice steady. "Truth and compassion must prevail over outdated secrecy." Together they examined the documents, piecing together fragments of the past. A notation about 2 infant baptisms performed in secret, a record of payment from the Miller family to the church building fund, coincidentally dated 3 days after the twins disappeared. A letter from Elizabeth Miller requesting special prayers for our newly blessed household. Mary's hands trembled as she connected these dots. They were here all along, she whispered. The church knew. Father Michael knelt beside her chair. Not everyone knew everything. The deception was compartmentalized. The lawyer knew one part, the clerk another, the priest something else. It was designed so no single person held the complete truth. John carefully organized the papers, creating a timeline. This is it, Grandma. With these records and Mrs. Goodwin's diary, we finally have enough to prove what happened. Mary touched the priest's hand in gratitude. Thank you for choosing truth. Father Michael nodded solemnly. Some will call it betrayal. I call it redemption. The autumn leaves were beginning to change when William Martin arrived at Mary Brown's farmhouse. The 88-year-old attorney leaned heavily on his cane, his weathered face carrying the burden of secrets kept too long. Mary invited him into her modest living room, where John had just stoked the fire against the growing chill. I should have come years ago, William confessed, removing a yellowed envelope from his coat pocket. His hands trembled as he passed it to Mary. Elizabeth Miller wrote this before she died. I was her lawyer and her confidant. Mary's fingers brushed against the brittle paper, her heart racing. For decades, the name Elizabeth Miller had been nothing but a whisper, a ghost haunting the edges of her search. Now, holding the woman's final confession, she felt an odd mixture of dread and vindication. The letter began simply, to whom it may concern, I cannot leave this world with this sin upon my soul. Mary read aloud, her voice faltering as Elizabeth's words detailed how she and her husband had paid substantial sums to acquire twin baby girls in March of. The childless couple had been desperate after multiple miscarriages, and when approached with an opportunity to adopt newborn twins, they seized it without questioning the legality. $10,000, Mary whispered. The sum enormous for that era. They purchased my daughters like merchandise. John placed a steadying hand on his grandmother's shoulder as she continued reading. Elizabeth described how she'd changed the girls' names, moved to a different neighborhood within the same county, and fabricated birth certificates. She wrote of bribing officials, including Robert Johnson at the county clerk's office, to destroy original records. She knew, Mary said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. All these years she knew I was searching, yet she kept them from me. William nodded solemnly. Elizabeth was consumed by guilt in her final days. She wanted to make amends but feared losing the daughters she'd raised. The letter ended with a plea for forgiveness, and the twins' current names, Rebecca and Catherine Miller, now grown women who sang in the church choir every Sunday, completely unaware of their true origins. Mary folded the letter carefully, placing it beside the faded photo album on her lap. The revelation brought both anguish and relief. The confirmation that her daughters had been alive all these years, living yet miles away, was both miraculous and devastating. Thank you for bringing this to me, she told William, her voice steady despite her tears. After 64 years of uncertainty, I finally understand what happened to my girls. As the elderly lawyer departed, Mary sat by the window watching golden leaves drift to the ground. The truth had finally emerged, like autumn's colors breaking through summer's green disguise. Her daughters were alive, and for the first time in decades, Mary had more than just hope. She had a path forward. Crisp autumn leaves crunched beneath John Brown's boots as he approached the county courthouse for the third time that week. The building's brick facade, once imposing, now seemed like a fortress guarding secrets his grandmother had spent a lifetime trying to uncover. John clutched his leather satchel tightly containing photocopies of Mrs. Goodwin's diary and the letter mentioning the distinctive scar. Those documents were sealed by court order in 1963. Robert Johnson repeated, his voice echoing through the nearly empty records room. The county clerk adjusted his glasses, deliberately slow in his movements. Even if they existed, which I'm not confirming, accessing them would be a criminal offense. Mary sat in the car outside, her fragile hands clutching a thermos of tea. At 88, she couldn't join the confrontation, but her determination fueled John's resolve. 3 generations of silence weighed on his shoulders as he slipped past security that evening, using the key Father Michael had reluctantly provided from the church's collection of community spares. The beam of his flashlight revealed rows of dusty file cabinets. John worked methodically, his heart pounding with each creak of the old building. In the drawer marked 1961, he found what they'd been searching for: adoption papers with obvious alterations, birth certificates with mismatched signatures, and payment records disguised as charitable donations. As he photographed the evidence with shaking hands, light suddenly flooded the room. 2 security guards, and Robert stood in the doorway, the clerk's face twisted with anger. Breaking and entering, theft of government property. Robert listed, already dialing the sheriff. Your grandmother's delusions have finally pushed you over the edge. John was escorted outside in handcuffs, the flash drive containing the photos confiscated. Through the patrol car window, he watched Mary's face crumple in despair. Everything they'd worked for seemed lost in an instant. Then, a woman's voice cut through the commotion. Stop this immediately. Linda Johnson strode across the parking lot, her authoritative tone halting even the sheriff mid-sentence. As a distant relative of the Miller family and the county's most respected judge, her presence commanded attention. I've suspected for years, Linda said, her eyes meeting Mary's through the car window. Elizabeth confessed everything to my mother before she died. I've been too cowardly to come forward. Linda turned to Robert, her voice steel. Release him now, or I'll ensure every forged document in that building becomes front-page news. Within an hour, John was free, the flash drive returned, and Linda was guiding them through the evidence that would finally prove what Mary had known all along. Her daughters hadn't vanished, they had been sold and hidden in plain sight, their identities obscured by paperwork and community silence. For the first time in 64 years, the truth had a powerful ally. The news spread through the rural Pennsylvania town like wildfire. Documents that had been sealed for decades were now exposed, revealing a conspiracy that had torn a family apart. For the first time since 1961, Mary Brown wasn't dismissed as the town eccentric or the old woman who couldn't let go. The community finally saw her for what she truly was, a mother whose love had never wavered, whose determination had finally pierced through 6 decades of carefully constructed lies. I always knew she wasn't crazy, whispered Sarah Davis to her husband as they walked to church that Thanksgiving morning. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching beneath their feet as they joined the unusually large congregation gathering for the special service. Mary sat in the front pew, her 88-year-old frame appearing somehow stronger despite her physical frailty. John Brown sat protectively beside his grandmother, occasionally squeezing her hand. The young man's face reflected both triumph and apprehension. They had uncovered the truth, but what would come of it? Father Michael Smith stood at the pulpit, his youthful features solemn as he addressed the packed church. Today we gather not only to give thanks, but to witness the power of faith and perseverance, he announced, his voice echoing through the wooden rafters. As the service progressed, tension mounted. Mary clutched her weathered handbag containing the faded photograph album, her most precious possession. When the choir filed in, she leaned forward, her heart pounding against her ribs. The first notes of the hymn rose toward the vaulted ceiling. Mary's breath caught in her throat as 2 women in the front row began to sing. Their voices blended in perfect harmony, rising above the others with a distinctive timbre that sent chills down her spine. Rebecca and Catherine, known to the congregation by different names, stood side by side unaware of the elderly woman whose tears now flowed freely. The scar above Rebecca's eyebrow caught the light as she swayed slightly with the music. Catherine's hand, with the birthmark Mary had memorized in her daughter's infancy, turned a page in the hymnal. The twins sang with their eyes closed, feeling the music rather than reading it. Their synchronized movements, the way they breathed at exactly the same moments, these were not learned behaviors but the innate connection of sisters separated by circumstance, but not by blood. It's them, Mary whispered, her voice barely audible. My girl. John steadied his grandmother as she trembled with emotion. Around them, the congregation, many complicit in the decades-long deception, watched in awe as 64 years of separation began to dissolve in the sacred space, carried away by the harmonious voices of 2 women who had no idea they were singing for their mother. Rebecca and Catherine stood at the front of the old church, their voices rising in perfect harmony, as they led the congregation through the familiar hymn. Mary Brown watched, transfixed, as the two women in their early 60s moved with identical gestures, the slight tilt of the head, the gentle sway of shoulders, the way their hands floated upward at the crescendo. These weren't just coincidental similarities, they were the unconscious echoes of a shared beginning. The morning light streamed through stained glass windows, illuminating Rebecca's face, just enough for Mary to see the thin crescent-shaped scar above her right eyebrow, the result of a fall from a rocking horse before the twins had even learned to speak. When Catherine reached up to turn the page of her hymnal, the small star-shaped birthmark on her wrist flashed into view, exactly as it had been 64 years ago. Mary's weathered hands began to tremble. These weren't strangers, these were her daughters, her flesh and blood, standing mere feet away after decades of separation. The realization crashed over her like a wave, stealing her breath and flooding her eyes with tears. Around her, the congregation continued singing, unaware of the miracle unfolding in their midst. John Brown, noticing his grandmother's reaction, gently squeezed her hand, his eyes asking a silent question. Mary nodded almost imperceptibly, unable to form words. As the final notes of the hymn faded, an unnatural silence fell over the church. Mary, despite her 88 years and frail health, rose slowly to her feet. Her tears flowed freely now, carving glistening paths down her cheeks. The movement caught Rebecca's attention first, then Catherine's, their identical expressions shifting from confusion to concern as they watched the elderly woman trembling in the fourth pew. "Emily," Mary whispered, using the name she'd given Rebecca at birth. "Sarah," she added, looking at Catherine. The names hung in the air, foreign yet familiar to the twins' ears. Father Michael Smith stepped forward, sensing the gravity of the moment. The young priest had seen many emotional responses during services, but nothing like the raw, unfiltered hope radiating from Mary's face. Every sleepless night spent pacing the hallways of her farmhouse, every rejection from officials who urged her to move on, every tear shed over faded photographs, all of it had led to this impossible moment. Decades of searching condensed into a single breath as Mary took one shaky step forward. The impossible had become real, manifested through the stubborn persistence of a mother's love that refused to dim, even when all hope seemed lost. In the reverent hush that followed the recognition, Father Michael Smith gently touched Mary's trembling shoulder. "Perhaps we should continue this moment somewhere more private," he suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. The young priest guided Mary Brown and her daughters ath the side door toward the sacristy, the congregation watching in stunned silence. The small room smelled of incense and beeswax. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting colored patterns across the wooden floor where Thomas Davis waited. The lawyer stood beside an aged leather portfolio, his methodical nature evident in how precisely he'd arranged the documents on the table. "I believe these belong to you, Mary," Thomas said, sliding forward a yellowed envelope. "William Martin entrusted these to me before his passing." With shaking fingers, Mary opened the envelope. Inside lay Elizabeth Miller's handwritten confession, penned in the final days of her life. The words blurred through Mary's tears as she read how Elizabeth had orchestrated the theft of her babies, driven by a desperate yearning for motherhood that had consumed her moral compass. "There's more," Thomas continued, producing a small ledger. Every payment, every bribe, meticulously recorded. Mrs. Miller was nothing if not thorough in her deception. Rebecca gasped as she examined a receipt with her birth date. $50, she whispered, the scar above her eyebrow creasing as she frowned. That's what we were worth to someone desperate enough to steal children. Any price would have seemed reasonable. Father Michael offered gently. Catherine, still stunned into near silence, traced the birthmark on her wrist. "We live just 3 miles from your farmhouse," she said to Mary. "All these years, we've passed each other at the market, at community gatherings." "I knew," Mary admitted, her voice breaking. "Something in my heart always recognized you even when my mind couldn't make sense of it." John Brown stood protectively behind his grandmother, one hand on her shoulder. "The town protected the Millers because they were influential. They convinced everyone it was better for you to believe your daughters had simply vanished." As the reality settled around them, the sacristy door opened slightly. Linda Johnson peered in, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering guilt. "The congregation is waiting," she said softly. When they emerged, the church erupted in applause and tearful embraces. Decades of secrets dissolved in that moment of truth. Mary stood between her daughters, their hands clasped tightly together, the weight of 64 years of searching finally lifting from her shoulders. The triumph of reunion came with a bittersweet edge. Mary Brown's frail hands trembled as she embraced her daughters, her body weakened by decades of searching and the weight of 88 years. The doctor had warned John about his grandmother's heart condition months ago, cautioning that strong emotions, even joyful ones, could tax her fragile system. Yet seeing the light in her eyes as she gazed at Rebecca and Catherine, John knew no medical warning could have kept her from this moment. "I won't lose you again," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible as she clutched Rebecca's hand. The scar above her daughter's eyebrow, once a childhood injury from falling off a swing, now served as irrefutable proof of her identity. Catherine stood close by, unconsciously rubbing the birthmark on her wrist, a habit she'd carried through 6 decades without knowing its significance to her true mother. The church's wooden pews became witness to their healing, creaking gently as the 3 women leaned into each other, sharing tears that spoke louder than words. Emotional wounds, both fresh and long festering, would need time to mend. The twins struggled with the revelation that their entire lives had been built on fabrication, while Mary battled guilt for not searching harder, faster, better. "We have time now," Catherine assured her, though everyone in the room understood the precious nature of that promise given Mary's age and health. John Brown stood a few steps away, his chest swelling with conflicting emotions, pride in having persevered where others had given up, relief that his grandmother's lifelong quest hadn't been in vain, and something unexpected, a profound sense of expansion in his own identity. Overnight, his family had grown to include not just 2 aunts but their children and grandchildren as well. Cousins he never knew existed now shared his blood, his history, his future. "You did it, Grandma," he said, placing a supportive hand on Mary's shoulder as she began to tire from the intensity of the reunion. The farmhouse that had echoed with Mary's lonely footsteps for decades would now need extra chairs at the dinner table. John imagined holiday gatherings filled with voices instead of silence, photo albums gaining new pages instead of merely preserving the past. The family tree, once stunted by deception, could finally grow toward the light. As they prepared to leave the church, John caught Father Michael's eye across the room. The young priest nodded in acknowledgement, a silent recognition that sometimes faith works through persistence rather than prayer alone. For the first time in his life, John understood what belonging truly meant. The morning after the reunion, Father Michael Smith invited Mary and her daughters to the churchyard. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the weathered gravestones as the priest carried a small potted plant in his hands. Rebecca and Catherine flanked their mother, their shoulders occasionally brushing against Mary's frail frame as if afraid she might disappear if they lost contact. "I thought we might plant something to commemorate this miracle," Father Michael said, gesturing to a patch of earth near the church entrance. "A lilac rosebush. They bloom year after year, no matter how harsh the winter." Mary Brown's weathered hands trembled as she accepted the garden trowel. The twins knelt beside her, supporting her arms as she broke the soil. Together, the 3 women planted the small bush, their fingers intertwining in the rich Pennsylvania earth. "When I was a little girl," Mary whispered, "my mother told me that lilacs represent the first emotions of love." She looked up at her daughters, eyes glistening. How fitting. The scent of freshly turned soil mingled with the lingering incense from that morning's service, creating a fragrance that seemed to Mary like the perfume of redemption itself. As they patted down the final handful of dirt, the church bells chimed noon, their resonant tones carrying across the small town. Across the street, Sarah Davis watched the scene unfold. Guilt had kept her awake for nights since the revelation of her mother-in-law's diary. Now, clutching a casserole dish, she crossed the road with determined steps. "I brought lunch," she announced, her voice catching. "It's not much, but I thought you might be hungry." By sunset, the churchyard had become an impromptu gathering. Rivett Johnson, the once obstructive county clerk, arrived with boxes of records he'd claimed didn't exist. Peter Johnson, who had threatened John to protect his family's involvement, stood awkwardly at the periphery until Catherine approached him with an unexpected offer of forgiveness. "We've all been prisoners of this secret," she said simply. John Brown watched from the church steps, his chest swelling with pride as neighbors arrived bearing food, photographs, and stories. Some came with tearful apologies, others with questions, but all approached with a newfound respect for the elderly woman who had never stopped believing. The community that had once dismissed Mary as delusional now rallied around her family. Old resentments dissolved in the face of such extraordinary perseverance. As twilight deepened, someone brought out lanterns, illuminating the newly planted rosebush, a living testament to a mother's undying hope and the healing power of truth, finally spoken aloud. As winter melted into spring, Mary Brown found herself navigating the delicate terrain of reconnection with Rebecca and Catherine. Their weekly meetings at her farmhouse became sacred rituals, filled with tentative conversations that often stumbled into uncomfortable silences. The 88-year-old would sometimes reach out to touch her daughter's hands, as if confirming they weren't apparitions that might vanish again. "I used to sing this to you both," Mary said one afternoon, humming a lullaby while showing them a page in her faded photo album. Rebecca's eyes welled with tears as her fingers traced the outline of herself as an infant, the small scar above her eyebrow visible even then. Catherine, more reserved than her sister, struggled with conflicting loyalties. Elizabeth was kind, she admitted quietly, but there was always something missing. She fingered the birthmark on her wrist, a mark that had become a symbol of her true identity. The twins, now in their 60s, brought their own children and grandchildren to meet Mary. These gatherings were chaotic and healing, filling the aging farmhouse with laughter that chased away decades of silence. Sometimes they'd sit on the porch swing, 3 generations watching fireflies dance across the Pennsylvania twilight, weaving new memories to replace those stolen by time and deceit. John found his own path to healing through action. He organized family reunions that grew larger with each passing month, connecting with cousins who had grown up never knowing of his existence. He compiled a family tree, meticulously documenting every branch and leaf, determined that no future generation would lose sight of their roots. "Grandma taught me that persistence matters," John told a gathering of relatives one Sunday after church. Some truths refused to stay buried. He had become the family historian, recording stories from Mary and the twins, preserving their journey from separation to reunion. The most poignant moments came unexpectedly. When Rebecca unconsciously used one of Mary's characteristic phrases, or when Catherine revealed she'd always collected lavender sashes without knowing why. These small echoes of inherited traits brought both joy and mourning for the years that could never be reclaimed. "I never stopped looking," Mary confessed during a thunderstorm that kept them all indoors. "Not for one day. And we never stopped feeling something was missing," Catherine replied, reaching for her mother's weathered hand. In these quiet exchanges, the family found their way forward, not erasing the past, but building around it, like a river carving a new path around immovable stone. Their shared blood proved stronger than the lies that had kept them apart. Father Michael Smith sat alone in the church after evening prayers, his fingers tracing the worn edges of his Bible. The reunion of Mary Brown with her daughters had profoundly changed him. For weeks he had wrestled with his role in keeping secrets, questioning whether his commitment to protecting the parish had blinded him to deeper truths. The young priest found himself drawn to Mary's unwavering faith, not just in God, but in the possibility of finding her children despite 6 decades of separation. Her perseverance had awakened something within him that seminary training never could. "Perhaps this is why I was called here," he whispered to the empty pews. Within months, Father Michael transformed the church basement into a resource center for families searching for lost loved ones. He gathered volunteers, organized records, and created a network connecting rural Pennsylvania communities often overlooked by larger missing persons organizations. "Everyone deserves the closure Mary found," he told his congregation one Sunday, "and every lost soul deserves to be searched for with the same dedication." The priest worked tirelessly, spending evenings helping families navigate bureaucratic mazes of adoption records and court documents. His collar opened doors that had remained firmly shut to ordinary citizens, and he wielded this influence with careful purpose. Meanwhile, Sarah Davis channeled her guilt into action. The knowledge that her mother-in-law had helped orchestrate the separation of Mary from her twins haunted her daily. She converted her living room into an informal meeting space where mothers shared stories of children taken through deception or coercion. "My family helped cause this pain," Sarah confided to a group of women clutching photographs of absent children. "I can't undo that, but I can make sure it doesn't happen to others." She partnered with Thomas Davis, using his legal expertise to challenge sealed records and questionable adoptions throughout the county. Their work uncovered 3 similar cases dating back to the 1950s, where young mothers had been separated from their children under dubious circumstances. The ripple effect spread throughout the community. Even Robert Johnson, once so determined to keep old records buried, began quietly cooperating with Father Michael's inquiries. The county clerk would slide manila envelopes under the church door after hours, his conscience finally outweighing his fear of scandal. Mary's story became a catalyst for healing old wounds. Families who had maintained decades of silence began speaking truth to power. The church, once complicit in separating families, now stood as a beacon for reunion and reconciliation. "This is what faith looks like in action," Father Michael often said, watching elderly mothers and their long-lost children embrace in his sanctuary. Not just believing in miracles, but working to make them possible. Through it all, the rural rhythms of Pennsylvania remained unchanged, a comforting constant in lives forever altered by truth. Patchwork quilts, lovingly stitched by the Women's Guild, adorned the wooden pews each winter, their colors brightening the sanctuary during the coldest months. The iron church bells, installed in 1924 according to the small brass plaque beneath them, continued marking the hours as they had for generations. Their familiar toll echoed across the valley, punctuating days filled with both ordinary moments and extraordinary healing. After Sunday services, Mary Brown would sit with her daughters in the church garden, savoring cups of mint tea prepared by Sarah Davis. The fragrant steam rose between them, bridging conversations that moved gradually from awkward to comfortable. These quiet moments allowed Rebecca and Catherine to absorb the reality of their true origins, while Mary drank in the presence of the children she had mourned for 6 decades. "I recognize your laugh," Mary told Catherine one afternoon, her weathered hand trembling as she reached for her daughters. "Even before I knew who you were, something in me recognized that sound." The harvest festivals transformed into celebrations of homecoming. John Brown organized the first reunion festival, inviting extended family members who had never known of the twins' existence. Tables stretched across the church lawn, laden with dishes prepared from recipes passed down through generations. Father Michael Smith blessed each gathering, his sermons weaving themes of forgiveness and redemption that resonated deeply with the congregation. Linda Johnson, once a hesitant ally, became a fixture at these celebrations. Her courage in coming forward had earned her a place of honor beside Mary. Together they watched as the community that had once maintained a conspiracy of silence now embraced truth and reconciliation. Outside the church, the lilac rosebush flourished, its roots deepening with each passing season. Children from the Sunday school added painted stones around its base, each one bearing a word of hope, faith, family, truth, love. During spring blooms, the fragrance drew visitors who had heard the remarkable story, some traveling from neighboring counties just to witness the living symbol of perseverance. The twins, now comfortable in their reclaimed identities, often sang duets during services, their harmonies more meaningful than any hymn alone could be. The congregation would watch Mary during these moments, her face illuminated with a joy that transcended the hardship of her long wait. In the golden afternoon light, filtering through stained glass windows, the ordinary rhythms of rural Pennsylvania became extraordinary, sanctified by a mother's unwavering love and the miracle it had wrought. In the warm glow of a Sunday afternoon, Mary Brown sat in her rocking chair on the farmhouse porch, her weathered hands resting atop a photo album no longer faded with sorrow but vibrant with new memories. The impossible had happened. A mother's relentless love had pierced through 64 years of deception and brought her daughters home. "Some call it a miracle," Mary would say to visitors who came to hear her story, "but miracles don't take 64 years of search." Her eyes, once dimmed by grief, now sparkled with the light of redemption. The true wonder wasn't just finding Rebecca and Catherine, but the courage they all found to forgive those who had torn them apart. Each Sunday the 3 women sat together in the third pew of the old church, their voices joining in harmony during hymns that once served as Mary's only connection to her lost children. Father Michael often paused during his sermons to acknowledge their presence, a living testament to faith and perseverance that strengthened his congregation more than any scripture reading could. John Brown had transformed too. The grandson who once shouldered his grandmother's seemingly impossible quest now led community efforts to help other families searching for missing loved ones. His partnership with Thomas Davis had evolved into a formal advocacy group that specialized in reuniting separated families. The lilac rosebush outside the church had grown robust and tall, its blooms scenting the air each spring. Local children were taught its significance, how it represented a love that refused to wither despite decades of heartbreak. Some parishioners claimed they could hear the church bells ring differently on the anniversary of the reunion, though most knew it was simply the power of the story affecting their perception. Throughout rural Pennsylvania, Mary's tale traveled from farmhouse to farmhouse, embellished sometimes but never losing its core truth. Sarah Davis had compiled the complete account in a leather-bound journal that was read aloud at community gatherings, ensuring that the town's complicity would never be forgotten nor repeated. Rebecca and Catherine, now comfortable in their reclaimed identities, often finished each other's sentences as if their separation had been merely a brief interruption rather than a lifetime apart. They had moved into cottages on either side of Mary's farmhouse, creating a family compound where holidays were celebrated with the exuberance of people making up for lost time. The greatest healing comes not from finding what was lost, Mary would say, her voice soft but certain, but from learning to love again after believing love impossible. Her story became more than local legend. It became a promise that even the deepest wounds could heal, and that faith, perseverance, and love could indeed bridge any divide, no matter how vast or long-standing.